folks. This is Herb Stevenson, continuing a podcast of natural passages revealing the unmarked doors of life. Something that's been coming up a lot lately, I've had conversation with people. Um, a lot of reactions, reactivity. Um, I would say political, the environment is very chaotic right now. Prices are in the air. All sorts of promises being made that they're going to change, but in the meantime, people going to the best, getting gasoline or various other necessities in life are very expensive. There's nothing I can do obviously, about anything like that. Um, but what I can do is I've talked about this in the past, and it's about a process called stalking by the Toltecs and various other groups. Many spiritual traditions, uh, uh, Gurdjieff, Gurdjieff, I believe it is, Gurdjieff, and others call it self-observation, remembering who you are. So I want to just briefly talk about some of this a little bit about how you might look at what's going on in your life from a very personal, in other words, a place where you react. So I call this frozen self versus the present self, and it's to explain to you as briefly as I can and clearly as I can about how we react to life, or how a better way of I like to say it is how do we respond to life. Um, when I say that, what I'm meaning is pretty straightforward. So I'll just start with that. Is the simplest way I can say is about the frozen self. Um, is that the frozen self is I can only see what I believe. And what that basically means is over the course of your lifetime, everybody's lifetime, we end up uh, creating a series of beliefs, and these beliefs basically shape how we react. They shape how we basically make meaning of life. Now, I'll elaborate on that a little bit here in a second. The present self is I see what is real, which means by staying completely present in the moment, I'm able to address myself in such a way as to um, pause, reflect, and choose, I guess is the way I would say it. And by doing that, what that does for me is it allows me then to focus. Instead of reacting, I respond to what is real in this moment. I'm going to let that sit for a second. So the Toltec, and as well as the others, some just call it self-observation, others call it stalking. I like the word phrase stalking, not into today's vernacular of it's chasing down somebody or haunting them. It's stalking is the ability to remain present without reacting or going into meaning making. That is storytelling. And most of the time, we don't really recognize we're doing storytelling most of the time. Once we start making meaning, we have decided how to frame what is real versus what is not real. And the impact of it is it creates massive problems for us. So another way of saying this is if I give you a roadmap, our frozen self basically is something happens and we're activated. Once we're activated, we begin to our identity, because that's how we create ourselves based on what we believe. Our identity says what's real, what's not real, but what we're really saying is how am I making meaning versus not making meaning. So a lot of what's been happening the last 12 years or so is this concept about fake news. And it's an understanding of that if you can get people to believe something, that's all they can see. So if it's contrary to what you've been told to believe, whatever what might be real or is real will be considered false. So what happens then is if I'm activated, my identity is threatened because this fits into the realm, let's say fake news. A narrative stabilizes around it, which I'm going to reject whatever is being said. And what ends up happening is my existing reality that makes me feel safe is restored. And this just keeps repeating over time. When we get into uh, the stalking process about being present, what that means is if I'm activated, the first thing I do is I witness myself. I witness what's going on. If I'm having a reaction, I say I'm having a reaction. And I catch myself because if I go into an automatic continuity, in other words, an automatic response, I interrupt it because I'm realizing I'm just having an emotional reaction here. And I need to say, one, I'm having an emotional reaction. And then I can see, am I starting to tell myself a story? And if I am, I pause. And when I pause, it breaks that repetitive flow and I end up, energy reorganizes. And now that energy reorganizes, new perceptions emerge and I don't freeze or what's the creative frozen self, which is crystallization. So when you look at that, another way of trying to understand that is a briefer version is the frozen self, whenever it's activated, it collapses into an identity contraction. I only narrow down to what I believe, and anything else is possible is no longer addressed or included. I immediately start developing a narrative to stabilize my perception so that I can make meaning and feel safe, basically. And as a result, I end up restoring that familiar reality that I've created from my belief system. So, in other words, time repeats through a crystallized identity. It just doesn't shift. So, we all have met people that no matter what you say to them, they're not going to hear you. So, it's that where the phrase comes from of you can talk to your blue in the face and nothing's going to make a difference. But a core distinction for the present self involves a stalking process. I'm witnessing um, myself to interrupt automatic responses and reactivities. Narrative becomes more transparent of, oh, that's a story I'm telling myself, or this is what the story I was told by somebody that now I'm looking at and saying, is that really true? And once I break that pattern, I do not go into the narrative. I say, what else is possible? Or what else could this mean? Or is it possible this is really true? And versus the automatic negation through what's been done with fake news. Energy reorganizes without fixation. We just are aware and then we choose a response. And when we do that, we have a new perception emerges without crystallization. In other words, we're more present to ourselves and more likely to be present to that person. So applied to stalking practices, if you're trying to understand what you might do, an easy way to think about it is you pause, observe, notice, interrupt, remain, and then allow. What that basically means is pause before any immediate reaction. Observe bodily contractions without explanation about, we often do that. We pull ourselves back or we hold our breath and those various types of things. And we observe it saying is, okay, I'm having a reaction. I'm contracting physically in my body, which means I am contracting what I am seeing. Notice the narrative forming in real time. When I contract, I'll immediately go to how do I feel safe? How do I respond to this? I interrupt any kind of defensive routine or continuity that's being professed to me in my own mind, basically. I remain present without stabilizing my identity around whatever this situation is, and I allow perception to be naturally reorganized. So the issue for all of us is to recognize the more present we are, the more we're able to realize that freedom is not changing the story. Freedom is no longer being fully organized by it. So whatever the story is or was, it's it's a situation where you have the capacity to begin to ask yourself, what do I really want to pay attention to? And right now, a lot of us have lost our sensibilities about that. Um, we've not looked at our belief systems. We've not been able to recognize that I can only see, which is what I believe, and what I believe will determine how I make meaning. And out of doing that, we minimize or eliminate many other possibilities that could be true. So frequently ask the question, what else could be true? Or is it possible that what's being said is true? Um, you can also ask the question is if somebody is really putting out emotional things that are triggering you, one of the ways to understand that somebody might be providing you a belief they want you to absorb. So that's the only way you can see is they do a feel good. They use phrases that make you feel good and or make you feel like I can relate to them. The real question you have to ask is where we fall into the trap is we get lost in the feel good and we're not paying attention is the possible truthfulness of what they're saying. Do they really care about us, or is this something that they truly might believe, but are they willing to, if I say something to them like, that's an interesting opinion, help me understand how you came to that conclusion. And when I do that, the impact of it is some people get very upset with me, throw their hands up and walk away and throw some profanities and a few other things up in the air. Others, though, stop and think about it and then begin to start the process of learning how to witness themselves, learning how to question what's being said to them, not jumping to conclusion, not jumping to a divisive process one way or another. And this isn't just politics. This is going to be any subject that we're having because what's happened is we don't realize that we have collectively created a set of beliefs that are not necessarily always based on, let's just say, facts, or I like to say reality. So I'd like you to think about this about, how do I witness myself? If you have a large reaction, how can I pause, reflect, and then choose how I wish to respond? And it's not necessarily just out of your emotionality because emotions generally cloud our entire meaning making and our thinking processes. Emotions drive the beliefs that we have now emotionally activated or embedded with strong energies that lead us to where we're going to repeat the same belief over and over and over. So I'd just like you to think about it. I think this is probably going to be a shorter video than usual. But I'm just noticing a lot of people are struggling, and when I can get them to stalk themselves, which is if I'm activated and I have a reaction, pause. What am I reacting to? What is it? How am I feeling it in my body? And feeling in my body, what happens if I breathe a few times and relax that tension and get clear and say, what's possible? What else could this mean? Things of that nature that can lead to my having a different response versus a big reaction that is emotionally based. I guarantee if you practice that on a regular basis, you'll be able to find out that you can come to a much more amenable position, more sense of satisfaction, and less reactivity in your life. So this is Herb Stevenson. I trust that this might be useful to you. It's Natural Passages Revealing Unmarked Doors of Life. And until we see each other again, thanks much.